March 28, 1942. State Nazaire, occupied France. 2:30 in the morning. A destroyer packed with explosives is ramming itself into the largest dry dock in the Atlantic at full speed. On the decks around it, 256 British commandos are gripping their weapons as tracer rounds tear across the Loire estuary from every direction. The noise is absolute. Searchlights slicing the darkness, men dying on the water before they even reach the dock. And the ones who make it ashore, the ones who sprint into the flaming chaos of a Nazi-held port with nothing but their own nerve, almost every single one of them is holding the same weapon. A weapon the British military establishment had dismissed as a tatty American gangster gun. A weapon used to murder 7 men in a Chicago garage. A weapon the IRA had used to ambush British soldiers on a Dublin road. Tonight, it is the weapon British commandos trust with their lives above every other option available to them, and here is what nobody talks about. When the war ended and the accountants said there was something cheaper, something lighter, something British, the commandos looked at it, handed it back, and kept their gangster guns. Why? What did these men know that the generals didn't? And how did a weapon born in American criminal violence become the most trusted tool in the hands of Britain's most elite fighters? The answer starts not with commandos, not with gangsters, but with one of the greatest military disasters in British history. June 4, 1940. The last boats are pulling away from Dunkirk. Over 300,000 men pulled off the sand. That is the miracle everyone remembers. What people forget is everything that stayed behind. Nearly 2,500 artillery pieces, over 63,000 vehicles, 600 tanks, and virtually every submachine gun the British Army owned, which wasn't many to begin with, because Britain had no domestic submachine gun in production, not a single factory making one. The army that had barely escaped annihilation now faced an enemy that might cross the Channel any week, and it had almost nothing for close-quarters fighting. Into that vacuum, somebody at the War Office made an uncomfortable call to New York. The cable was blunt. Send as many Thompson machine carbines as possible, because the Thompson was not a weapon respectable military establishments wanted near them. It was Al Capone's gun. It was the Sten. Valentine's Day Massacre. 7 men cut down in a Chicago garage by 2 Thompsons firing 70 rounds in under a minute. Every British soldier who had sat in a cinema knew exactly what this gun was. The Board of Ordnance had already called it, according to multiple accounts, a tatty American gangster gun, and there was something darker still. The IRA had been among the Thompsons' very first customers. Nearly 500 were seized on the ship East Side in Hoboken in June 1921. The first confirmed combat use of the Thompson anywhere in the world was an IRA ambush on a British troop train near Drumcondra, Dublin, that same month. British soldiers had already died to this weapon, and now Britain was begging to buy it. But here is what the history books gloss over. The men who would carry the Thompson into combat, storming Norwegian fjords, blowing up Atlantic dry docks, fighting through Burmese jungle, those men would eventually be given a choice: keep the gangster gun or take the new British replacement. They chose the gangster gun every single time. To understand why, you need to understand what the Thompson actually was underneath its reputation. John Taliaferro Thompson was not a gangster. He was a United States Army general and a former chief of the Small Arms Division who had spent 2 decades thinking about one problem: how do you clear a trench? By 1917, the Western Front had turned infantry combat nightmarish and medieval. Men fighting at arm's length in 6-foot ditches, standard rifles too long and too slow. Thompson called his solution a trench broom, a weapon a single man could carry that fired pistol caliber ammunition fast enough to sweep a position clean. He built it, filed the patents, went into production. Then on November 11, 1918, the armistice was signed. The prototypes were sitting on a dock, waiting to ship to France. The war they were built for was over. Thompson spent the next 2 decades watching his invention become famous for the wrong reasons. Criminals found it first because criminals always find the powerful things first. By the time the military took it seriously, the reputation was set in concrete. The British Purchasing Commission in New York had begun quiet negotiations with Auto-Ordnance back in January 1940. The first contract covered just 750 guns, then Sweden swept in and drained the inventory. Auto-Ordnance had sold only about 10,000 Thompsons in nearly 2 decades. New production had to be arranged through Savage Arms of Utica, New York. And then orders escalated at a pace that tells you everything about how desperate things had become. By December 1940, Britain had placed 13 separate contracts totaling 107,500 weapons, valued at over $21 million. Each gun cost roughly $200, including walnut stocks, drum and box magazines, a sling, and 1,000 rounds. After Lend-Lease passed in March 1941, total British orders eventually reached 514,000 Thompsons. Britain became the largest foreign customer of a weapon it had publicly despised. But something happened when those guns arrived that the generals hadn't expected and the accountants couldn't measure. What troops received was the M1928A1. A beautifully machined weapon of walnut and blued steel, weighing 10.8 pounds empty, 14.75 with a loaded drum. It fired 45 ACA at 935 feet per second, 600 to 800 rounds per minute. The British condemned drum magazines immediately, too heavy, too noisy on patrol, and shipped thousands back to America in exchange for 20 and 30 round box magazines. Inside the bolt sat the Blish lock, a delayed blowback mechanism based on Commander John Bell Blish's theory that phosphor bronze created adhesion against steel grooves under high chamber pressure, delaying bolt movement and theoretically making the action safer. The theory was completely wrong. British armourers in North Africa proved it definitively by removing the Blish lock entirely and replacing it with a simple hex bolt. The guns kept working, jams decreased, deleting the lock, removing the cuts compensator, replacing the adjustable rear sight with a fixed aperture. Eliminating drum magazine capability. Cost dropped from $209 per unit to $45. Simpler, cheaper, in many ways better. But none of that engineering explains what happened with the Commandos. For that, you have to go to Norway, December 27, 1941. Vågsøy, 576 men of No. 3 Commando hit German positions in fierce house-to-house fighting against mountain troops on leave from the Eastern Front. Inside 50 meters in doorways and stairwells, the 45 ACK round did what 9mm could not. It dumped its energy immediately. A 230-grain bullet at 935 feet per second carries a different authority than a lighter, faster round. It doesn't need to travel through a man to deliver its force. The raid killed over 120 Germans, captured 98, and seized a complete copy of the German Naval Code. Then 3 months later came the operation that defined everything, Operation Chariot, St. Nazaire, March 28, 1942. Destroy the Normandy dock, the only Atlantic dry dock capable of servicing the battleship Tirpitz. Deny Tirpitz that dock and she could never safely operate in open ocean. The plan was borderline insane. An obsolete destroyer packed with delayed explosives would ram the dock gates at full speed. Commandos would go ashore, destroy the pumping machinery and every piece of infrastructure that made the dock function, then fight their way back to the boats. Protection teams guarding demolition parties were armed specifically with Thompson submachine guns. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Newman led his men Thompson in hand. Of 612 raiders, 169 were killed and 215 captured. 5 Victoria Crosses awarded. The most decorated single British operation of the Second World War. The Thompson was at the centre of every account that survived. Here is the comparison the generals were making on paper, and here is why the paper lied. The German MP40 weighed 8.82 pounds empty, fired 9mm at 1,247 feet per second. Better range, flatter trajectory, lighter, more compact with its folding stock, cheaper at roughly $24 a unit. On paper, the modern weapon. But the Thompson's 45 round weighed nearly twice the 9mm, 230 grains against 125. And inside 50 meters that difference was catastrophic for whoever received it. The Thompson offered select fire, both semi and full automatic, while the MP40 was full automatic only, burning ammunition faster in a sustained fight. The Thompson's double-column, double-feed magazines were substantially more reliable than the MP40's notoriously finicky single-feed design, which had a documented habit of failing when loaded to full capacity. The Thompson was heavier, costlier, more complex. It was also in the hands of the men carrying it into the worst fighting, the weapon they trusted with their lives. That trust had real costs. The weight punished long patrols. In Burma, the heavy 45 round couldn't penetrate small diameter trees, limiting jungle effectiveness. In North Africa, tight machining tolerances invited sand, and 45 ACK had to ship from America while a Sten could fire captured German 9mm off any battlefield. The Thompson had genuine flaws. The men who carried it knew them. They kept it anyway. In Burma, Lieutenant George Nolan of No. 1 Commando snatched up a fallen comrade's Thompson during a desperate defensive action. His Victoria Cross citation records that he sprayed the advancing enemy and was mortally wounded stemming the assault, though not before killing and wounding many attackers. His section held for 12 hours despite 14 of 24 men becoming casualties. Not statistics. Men in the worst situations imaginable choosing to pick up a Thompson when anything else lay around them. When the Sten arrived in 1941 as a replacement, the Mark I weighed 6.5 pounds, fired 9mm, cost $10, built-in 5 man-hours from stamped metal. It also jammed from its single-feed magazine and discharged when dropped cocked. Soldiers called it the plumber's nightmare. The stench gun. Britain produced 4.5 million because it had no choice. The Sten was never meant to be superior. It was meant to be good enough in impossible quantities. According to Martin Pegler, former senior curator at the Royal Armouries, Sten guns became a priority for all European theatre Commonwealth troops, with the specific exception of the commando brigades, who were mostly supplied with Thompsons and wanted to keep them. At a time when Britain was rationing everything, the decision was made to keep supplying expensive American guns to the Commandos because the Commandos refused to function without them. That is not a bureaucratic footnote. That is a verdict. John Taliaferro Thompson died on June 21, 1940, aged 79 of a heart attack. He died exactly as the British cables were flying to New York, exactly as the weapon he had spent 2 decades watching misused was finally being recognized for what it was. He never saw Vågsøy. He never saw Saint Nazaire. He never saw the commando shoulder badge, a stylized Thompson still worn today. He never saw the men who refused to give his gun up. By war's end, 1.7 million Thompsons had been manufactured. Britain received the largest foreign share. The weapon served through Korea and was not declared obsolete until the early 1950s. A weapon conceived for one war, arriving too late for it, adopted by criminals, used to kill British soldiers, publicly dismissed, then bought in desperation and carried into the most decorated raids of the Second World War. The commando brigades didn't keep their Thompsons out of sentiment. They kept them because they had been in the rooms and doorways and burning dockside streets where the choice of weapon meant the difference between walking out and not. Their assessment was made under conditions no ordnance board ever replicated, and their verdict was unanimous. Now, the British military called this a tatty gangster gun and refused to consider it seriously, right up until the moment they desperately needed it. What other weapons in history got dismissed for the wrong reasons and only proved their worth when it was almost too late? Tell me in the comments.